A German guard stares at the contraption hidden inside a hollowed book, his face draining of color. For 7 months, Allied intelligence has been flowing out of one of Germany's most secure prison camps, and the transmitter responsible was built from watch parts and bed springs. March 24th, 1943. Stalag Luft III, Sagan, Germany. Flight Lieutenant Kenneth Lockwood pressed his ear against the wooden floorboard, listening. The rhythm of boot steps moved past Block 104, fading toward the cookhouse. 3 guards on patrol. Right on schedule. He waited another 30 seconds, counting his heartbeats, then lifted the loose board with fingertips that had memorized every grain and splinter. The space beneath held his life's work for the past 14 months. Lockwood was 31 years old, a navigator from 76 Squadron who'd been shot down over the Ruhr Valley in January 1942. The Germans had processed him through Stalag Luft, the interrogation center, then shipped him here to Stalag Luft III, the Luftwaffe's showpiece camp for captured Allied airmen. The compound sprawled across pine forest 50 miles southeast of Berlin. 6 compounds, each holding up to 1,000 prisoners, surrounded by double barbed wire fences, guard towers, and searchlights that turned night into perpetual gray dawn. But Lockwood hadn't spent 14 months staring at fences. He'd spent them building a radio. The transmitter lay disassembled in the cavity beneath his bunk, wrapped in waxed paper salvaged from Red Cross parcels. Lockwood lifted out the main chassis first, a wooden frame the size of a cigar box, its interior packed with components that would have made a German signals officer weep. Vacuum tubes liberated from the camp's medical equipment, capacitors wound by hand using strips of tin foil and paper. A tuning coil made from copper wire pulled strand by strand from electrical cables in the wall. Resistors color-coded with paint stolen from the theater workshop. Every piece had a story. Every connection represented a risk someone had taken. The vacuum tubes had cost 3 bars of chocolate and a promise to the British doctor who'd claimed they were damaged beyond repair during a supply delivery. The wire came from Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, the South African pilot who ran the escape committee, ex-organization, they called it, who'd orchestrated a systematic dismantling of every electrical fixture the Germans wouldn't immediately notice missing. The crystal oscillators came from Swiss watches that prisoners had crushed during staged fights, salvaging the quartz timing crystals before the guards could confiscate the damaged timepieces. Lockwood assembled the transmitter with movements refined through hundreds of repetitions. The chassis connected to the power supply unit, his masterpiece of improvised engineering. The Germans kept the barracks wired with electrical current for a few hours each evening, enough for a handful of light bulbs that barely illuminated the spaces where 300 men lived. Lockwood had tapped into that supply through contacts hidden behind a wall socket, running the connection through a crude rectifier that converted AC to DC. The rectifier itself was built from salvaged diodes and a transformer he'd wound by hand, counting each loop of wire while pretending to read letters from home. The antenna was the boldest part of the operation. Lockwood had enlisted the help of a dozen men who didn't know what they were helping build. Bed springs, they thought. Reinforcement for the bunks that sagged under the weight of men who'd grown thin on German rations. He'd snipped the springs systematically over 6 months, taking 2 wires here, 3 there, never enough to make a bunk unusable. Those wires now formed a dipole antenna strung through the wall cavity, running the length of the barracks attic. Hidden beneath roofing felt that Australian prisoners had accidentally torn loose during a windstorm they'd predicted with suspicious accuracy. The transmitter was complete now, sitting on his bunk with the innocent appearance of a homemade box radio, the kind prisoners built to listen to BBC broadcasts on captured German receivers. The guards tolerated those. They'd even smile condescendingly at the British and their desperate need to hear news from home. They had no idea this one could transmit. Lockwood glanced toward the window. Flying Officer James Morton stood there, hands in pockets, watching the compound with the casual attention of a man observing clouds. Morton was his lookout, a pilot from 103 Squadron who could spot a guard's routine change from 50 yards and had once noticed a Gestapo inspector's arrival 3 minutes before the man entered the compound gate. If Morton shifted his weight to his left foot, the corridor was clear. If he touched his right hand to the window frame, guards were coming. Morton's weight stayed centered. All clear. Lockwood connected the power supply, his fingers moving through the sequence automatically. The transmitter required a warm-up period, 60 seconds for the tubes to heat, another 30 for the oscillator to stabilize. During that 90 seconds, the device drew enough current to dim the lights in Block 104 if anyone was paying attention. They'd solve that problem by bribing a French electrician with cigarettes to install a capacitor bank in the main junction box, smoothing out the load fluctuations. The pilot light glowed amber. Lockwood adjusted the frequency dial, setting it to the predetermined wavelength that changed weekly based on a code only he and London knew. The code had come through Squadron Leader Herbert Massey, the senior British officer, who received it buried in letters from his wife, actually an MI6 operator in London who signed her letters Margaret and filled them with gossip about relatives whose names encoded transmission frequencies and timing windows. Lockwood touched the telegraph key, feeling its familiar resistance. He'd made the key from a spring-loaded clothespin, silver contacts from melted-down German coins, and a mounting board salvaged from a packing crate. It clicked with mechanical precision as he tapped out the preamble sequence. Then he began transmitting. The message was brief. Intelligence gathered from 40 sources across the camp. German troop movements observed by prisoners assigned to work details outside the wire. Luftwaffe squadron designations overheard from guards who talked too freely around men they assumed didn't speak German. Production figures from a nearby aircraft factory, compiled from conversations with impressed workers who supervised prisoner labor. Morale assessments, security changes, the transfer schedule for SS units rotating through the Eastern Front. Each detail had been memorized by the man who gathered it, passed through verbal dead drops, and compiled by Squadron Leader Bushel's intelligence staff. Lockwood reduced it to Morse code, clean, efficient, impossible to intercept, without specialized direction finding equipment the Germans didn't deploy inside their own prison camps. The transmission lasted 4 minutes. Lockwood sent the closing sequence, disconnected the power supply, and disassembled the transmitter with the same practiced efficiency. Every component went back into its waxed paper wrapping. Every wrapping went into the floor cavity. The loose board went down with a whisper of wood on wood. He was standing at his bunk, reading a letter from his sister in Surrey, when Morton turned from the window and said, "Clear. Nice evening." "Quite pleasant," Lockwood agreed. 7 months. They'd been transmitting for 7 months, every 4 days like clockwork, feeding intelligence to London that was shaping Allied operations from North Africa to the Atlantic. 7 months of assembling and disassembling, of timing transmissions to guard rotations, of distributing risk across enough people that no single arrest could compromise the operation. 7 months, and the Germans had no idea. October 12th, 1943. Stalag Luft III. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schultz stood in the center of Block 104 with the expression of a man who'd just discovered his bank account had been emptied by a child with a crayon. The transmitter lay on Lockwood's bunk, fully assembled, its components gleaming under the afternoon light that poured through windows the guards had ordered opened. "This," Schultz said in precise English, "is not possible." Lockwood said nothing. He stood at attention near the door, flanked by 2 guards with rifles, watching the German signals officer examine the radio with the careful attention of a jeweler assessing a forgery. Schultz had been called in from the administration building after the morning search, a surprise inspection that had caught everyone off guard. A Gestapo tip, one of the guards had muttered. Someone had informed on someone, though no one knew who or why. The search team had found the loose floorboard within 20 minutes. Schultz lifted the power supply unit, turning it over in his hands. He was 45 years old, a veteran of the Great War who'd spent the interwar years teaching electrical engineering at the University of Munich. The Luftwaffe had commissioned him in 1940 and assigned him to camp security, evaluating escape tools, and confiscating contraband. He'd seen crystal radio sets, improvised compasses, forged documents, the usual inventory of prisoner ingenuity. He'd never seen anything like this. "The tubes," Schultz said, speaking to himself in German before switching back to English. "These are from the medical equipment. The X-ray machine, yes, but the transformer." He traced the winding with one finger. "Hand wound. 40-gauge wire. How did you calculate the turns ratio?" Lockwood met his eyes. "Basic electromagnetic theory. Hauptmann. They taught us mathematics in school." Schultz's jaw tightened. He set down the power supply and picked up the telegraph key, examining the silver contacts. German coins, melted and reformed. He pressed the key, listening to its click. The spring tension is calibrated. This is precision work. "Where did you learn this?" "RAF signals training," Lockwood said. "Standard curriculum. The RAF does not teach prisoners how to build transmitters from scrap metal and watch parts." Schultz's voice rose, the first crack in his professional composure. This is engineering. Real engineering. The frequency stability alone requires." He stopped, collecting himself. "How long has this been operational?" Lockwood said nothing. Schultz turned to the assembled prisoners. 30 men from Block 104 who'd been ordered to stand and watch while the Germans conducted their investigation. "Someone will tell me. The penalty for operating a clandestine transmitter is execution, not prison, not solitary confinement. Execution. But if you cooperate, if you tell me who helped, who provided materials, who stood watch, there may be leniency." The room stayed silent. Schultz picked up the antenna wire, following its connection point. His eyes tracked upward, realizing the wire ran into the wall. His face changed. "The attic. You ran it into the attic." He spun toward the senior guard. "Get men up there. Now, I want that antenna traced from end to end." Guards climbed into the roof space, while Schultz continued his examination. He was muttering in German now, too rapid for most of the prisoners to follow, but Lockwood caught enough to understand. 7 months. The Hauptmann had calculated transmission times based on power consumption logs from the camp electrical system. 7 months of regular transmissions, each lasting approximately 4 minutes, each drawing just enough current to remain beneath the threshold that would have triggered an investigation. "You have been sending intelligence to London," Schultz said finally, "for 7 months, from inside a German prison camp." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Do you understand what you've done? The Abwehr has been searching for a resistance radio in Sagan for half a year. They've arrested civilians, shut down businesses, interrogated factory workers. The direction-finding teams have been tracking a signal they couldn't localize because it kept disappearing." He gestured at the transmitter, "because it was inside the wire, inside my camp." The guards returned from the attic carrying the antenna, 20 meters of bedspring wire, carefully spliced and insulated with rubber from salvaged gas masks. Schultz laid it out on the floor, examining each connection point. When he reached the feed point where the antenna connected to the transmitter, he stopped. "This is impedance matched," he said quietly. "You calculated the impedance and matched it. A standing wave ratio below 1.5, I would estimate. This is not amateur work. This is professional radio engineering." He turned to Lockwood, and for the first time, there was something other than anger in his expression. Respect, maybe, or horror at what prisoners had accomplished under his watch. "Who are you?" Schultz asked. "Your file says navigator, combat navigator, 76 Squadron. But this," he gestured at the transmitter, "this is not the work of a navigator." "I had time to learn," Lockwood said. "Time to learn." Schultz repeated the words like they were a foreign phrase he was trying to pronounce. "Flight Lieutenant, do you understand that I will be court-martialed for this? That my entire security staff will face investigation? That the Gestapo will tear this camp apart looking for your co-conspirators?" He moved closer, his voice dropping. "Tell me who helped you. Give me names. It will go easier for everyone." Lockwood looked at the men standing around the barracks. Morton, who'd stood watch for 7 months without knowing what he was watching for. Wilson, who'd smuggled vacuum tubes from the medical building. Davies, who'd supervised the antenna installation. 30 men who'd contributed pieces to a puzzle none of them fully understood, trusting that their work served some greater purpose. I worked alone, Hauptmann, Lockwood said. Everything you see, I built myself. The wire for my own bed, the components from my own Red Cross parcels, the knowledge for my own training. No one helped me. No one knew. It was a lie transparent enough that Schultz's face colored with renewed anger. Do not insult my intelligence, Flight Lieutenant. One man cannot. One man did. Lockwood interrupted. And if you want to shoot someone for it, Hauptmann, shoot me. But you'll find no evidence of conspiracy. No witnesses who'll admit to knowledge. No paper trail leading to co-conspirators. Just one prisoner with too much time and too much determination. Schultz stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned to the senior guard. Take him to the cooler. Solitary confinement, pending investigation. No contact with other prisoners. No visitors. He looked back at Lockwood. The Gestapo will want to interview you personally. I suggest you prepare better answers than the ones you've given me. October 15th, 1943. Camp Commandant's office. Oberst Friedrich von Lindener Wildaw sat behind his desk, reading Hauptmann Schultz's report for the third time. The commandant was 58 years old, an aristocrat from an old military family who'd fought in the Great War and returned to service in 1939 with considerable reluctance. He'd been assigned to Stalag Luft III in 1942 with orders to run a model camp, secure but humane, a showcase of German military professionalism that would demonstrate proper treatment of Allied prisoners. The radio transmitter was not part of that showcase. 7 months, von Lindener said, setting down the report. For 7 months, we transmitted Allied intelligence from this facility directly to London, and no one noticed. Not the guards, not the security staff, not the direction-finding teams who were searching the entire district for this signal. Schultz stood at attention before the desk. Herr Oberst, the sophistication of the device. I have read your assessment, Hauptmann. Von Lindener tapped the report. You describe it as professional-grade equipment constructed from improvised materials. You estimate the prisoner required advanced knowledge of radio engineering, access to specialized tools, and assistance from at least a dozen co-conspirators. He looked up, yet the prisoner claims he worked alone. He is lying, Herr Oberst. Obviously lying. The antenna installation alone. Have you found evidence of conspiracy? Schultz hesitated. The investigation is ongoing. We have identified several prisoners with technical knowledge. Evidence, Hauptmann. Testimony. Physical proof. Have you found anything that would convince a military tribunal that Flight Lieutenant Lockwood had accomplices? No, Herr Oberst. Not yet. The prisoners are maintaining a coordinated silence. They refuse to provide testimony against each other. Standard prisoner protocol when facing investigation. Von Lindener rose from his desk, moving to the window that overlooked the compound. From here, he could see all 6 blocks of the officers' section. Gray barracks arranged in neat rows, prisoners moving between buildings in the afternoon light. 3,000 Allied airmen, each one trained to resist interrogation, each one committed to making escape attempts regardless of the consequences. The Gestapo wants him, von Lindener said. They want to interrogate him at their facility in Breslau. They believe he's part of a larger intelligence network. Is he, Herr Oberst? I don't know. Von Lindener turned from a window. What I do know is that if we hand a prisoner to the Gestapo for interrogation, we violate the Geneva Convention. The Red Cross will hear of it. The protecting power will protest. Berlin will face diplomatic pressure at a time when we are trying to convince the world that Germany respects international law. But he operated a clandestine transmitter. Under military law, Hauptmann, that is an act of war, not espionage. He is a serving officer who continued military operations while in captivity. We can punish him within the framework of camp discipline, but we cannot treat him as a spy. Von Lindener returned to his desk. The Gestapo will argue differently. They will claim he's saboteur, terrorist, an unlawful combatant. They will want to make an example of him, and I will refuse their request because I command this camp, not the SS. Schultz absorbed this. What are your orders, Herr Oberst? 30 days solitary confinement. Standard punishment for possession of contraband communication equipment. The transmitter will be destroyed. All components will be confiscated. You will submit a final report documenting the security failure and recommending improvements to prevent similar incidents. Von Lindener fixed Schultz with a hard look. And you will find those improvements, Hauptmann, because if another prisoner builds a radio under your watch, I will not be able to protect you from the consequences. Jawohl, Herr Oberst. Dismissed. After Schultz left, Von Lindener returned to the window. The afternoon light was fading, turning the compound into a landscape of long shadows and gray buildings. Somewhere in Block 104, prisoners were already working on the next radio, the next escape tunnel, the next operation that would demonstrate their refusal to accept captivity as defeat. He'd been a soldier long enough to recognize brilliance when he saw it. The transmitter was brilliant, not just in its construction, but in its conception. Someone had looked at a prison camp's limitations and seen possibilities, had taken wire and watches and electrical fixtures and transformed them into a functioning communication system, had operated that system for 7 months without detection, feeding intelligence to an enemy that was using it to kill German soldiers. Von Lindener should have been angry, should have demanded blood, retribution, examples made. Instead, he felt a grudging admiration for an enemy who'd turned imprisonment into an opportunity for resistance. November 14th, 1943. Block 104. Lockwood returned to the barracks after 30 days in the cooler, the solitary confinement block where prisoners serve punishment in cells barely large enough to stand. He'd spent the time reviewing every decision, every connection, every choice that had led to the radio's discovery. Not with regret, with analysis, understanding where the operation had succeeded and where it had failed. The prisoners greeted him with subdued celebration, handshakes, backslaps, careful congratulations that wouldn't attract guard attention. Squadron leader Bushel pulled him aside that evening, speaking in the low tones men used when discussing things the walls might hear. London confirmed, Bushel said. 7 months of intelligence, troop movements, production figures, security protocols. They used it for operational planning in Italy, for convoy routing in the Atlantic, for targeting Luftwaffe airfields in France. He paused. They want to know if we can rebuild it. Lockwood shook his head. Schultz tripled the electrical inspections. They're checking wall sockets daily, monitoring power consumption in real time. They gutted the attic and sealed the cavities. They've learned too much about how we did it the first time. So we do it differently the second time. We don't have the components. They've restricted Red Cross packages, confiscated every watch in the camp, dismantled the medical equipment. They've isolated the prisoners with electrical knowledge. Morton's in a different block now. Wilson's been transferred to another compound. They're not taking chances. Bushel absorbed this. What about the antenna wire? The guards returned your bed springs. Only after verifying they're too short to be useful. Lockwood smiled slightly. Schultz personally inspected every bunk in Block 104. Made us demonstrate that the springs actually support the mattresses. Thorough. He's good at his job. That's why it took 7 months before he found us. Lockwood looked around the barracks. Men reading, playing cards, writing letters in the fading daylight. We proved it could be done. That's what matters. We proved that prisoners can maintain active intelligence operations from inside a German camp. That knowledge alone is worth more than whatever intelligence we transmitted. The Gestapo wanted you, Bushel said. The commandant refused to hand you over. Caused quite a scene at Berlin headquarters, from what I heard through the grapevine. Von Lindener cited Geneva Convention protections. Said you were a legitimate combatant conducting military operations, not a spy. Lockwood nodded. I met him once, during the investigation. He asked me the same question Schultz asked. Who helped me? I told him the same lie. He paused. He didn't believe it either, but he accepted it. Said he understood duty, that he'd done questionable things himself during the last war, things that probably looked insane to the men investigating them afterward. Did he ask about the intelligence we transmitted? Never. I think he didn't want to know. Didn't want confirmation that his camp had compromised German military operations for 7 months. Lockwood pulled a letter from his pocket, mail from home that had arrived during his confinement. My sister writes that her husband's unit was redirected to Sicily in July. She doesn't know why. Says it seemed random at the time. Bushel understood immediately. One of the troop movements we reported. Probably. We'll never know for sure which pieces of intelligence London acted on, but somewhere out there, Allied commanders made decisions based on information we sent from this camp. That's not nothing. No, Bushel agreed. That's definitely not nothing. They stood in silence, watching the compound settle into evening routine. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Searchlights flickered on. 3,000 prisoners prepared for another night in captivity, another day of planning, improvising, resisting in whatever ways they could manage. The Germans had found the radio, had dismantled it, studied it, learned from it, had tightened security, closed loopholes, implemented countermeasures that would make future operations more difficult. But they hadn't stopped the operation. They'd only delayed it. Somewhere in Block 104, in blocks across the compound, in camps across Germany, Allied prisoners were already planning the next radio, the next tunnel, the next operation that would demonstrate their absolute refusal to accept captivity as surrender. Lockwood had shown them it was possible, had proved that prison walls couldn't contain determination, that guards couldn't confiscate ingenuity, that with enough patience and cooperation, prisoners could maintain active intelligence operations under the most secure surveillance. The Germans were shocked when they discovered the radio. They'd be shocked again when they discovered what prisoners were building next. The transmitter never operated again. Hauptmann Schultz's security improvements proved too comprehensive to bypass with the resources available to Lockwood and his collaborators. But the impact of those 7 months extended far beyond the immediate intelligence gathered. The radio's discovery prompted a complete review of prisoner camp security across Germany. The Luftwaffe implemented new protocols for electrical system monitoring, material inventory control, and prisoner surveillance. They trained guards to recognize improvised electronics. They restricted access to components that could be repurposed for radio construction. They learned, essentially, to think like prisoners, to see every tool, every material, every system as a potential resource for resistance operations. But prisoners learned too. They learned that sophisticated intelligence operations were possible even in maximum security facilities. They learned that systematic cooperation could defeat comprehensive surveillance. They learned that determination and technical skill could transform a prison camp into an active combat post. Flight Lieutenant Kenneth Lockwood remained at Stalag Luft III until the camp's evacuation in January 1945, when prisoners were force-marched west ahead of the advancing Soviet army. He survived the march, was liberated by American forces in April, and returned to Britain in May 1945. He never built another radio. Never needed to. The one he'd built had already changed everything.